Okay, so let me welcome you. My name is Daniel Kocher-Schrade, and I'm a visual artist at Hampshire and the Hampshire College faculty, and I'm the moderator of today's book panel discussion of my colleague Jennifer Bajorek's most recent book, Unfixed. We will discuss Unfixed, which was published with Duke University Press already in February 2020 with Dr. Malick Ndiaye and Jennifer Bajorek, who are both present in this visual space today here. Without any further ado, I think I hand it over to Jennifer. Jennifer, please.
So thank you, Daniel, and thank you all for being here. I do have a quick list of thanks, short list of thanks, too short to read very quickly before I move into the selection from the book. So I do want to express my thanks to both Omar and Daniel, my colleagues at Hampshire, for hosting and moderating the event, for bringing us together, to Malick for agreeing to be here and be in conversation with me, even when he's so busy and traveling. I'm sad that Jean Bernard could not be with us, but he's here with us in spirit. I did want to say thank you explicitly to Elizabeth Alt at Duke University Press, my editor, and the entire team at Duke for making the book possible as a book. It was a long time coming. And I also wanted to express my thanks to 4 collaborators who I think of almost as co-authors and often explicitly as co-authors of the book. Those are Fatima Fall in Saint Louis, Senegal, Franck Ogou in Porto Novo, Benin, Erin Haney and Leslie Rabin in the US. They really are fellow travelers. I think some of them may be with us today, and they've supported this project from the beginning in truly vital ways. I did want to give additional explicit thanks to Pradeep Dalal and the Arts Writers Grant team at the Andy Warhol Foundation for critical support, and also to CAA for support of the book. A final word of thanks goes to all of the photographers and their families who so generously gave me their time, access to their collections, and permission to reproduce their photographs. I'd like also to acknowledge that many of them have not yet seen the book due to the challenges posed by COVID. As Daniel mentioned, the book was published in late February 2020, just before the COVID lockdowns. So I was not able to travel with the book to Senegal and Benin that summer as I had hoped. So I do hope to rectify this soon. I'm going to read very briefly, it's less than 10 minutes, from part 2 of the book. This is the part of the book on political photography. I'm going to read from the section intro and from chapter 4, which is titled Africanizing Political Photography. And in the chapter, I'm looking at the rise of the genre, various conditions that may or may not have contributed to its rise at a particular moment in time. I'm looking at its meanings for the photographers, and I'm looking at questions of contemporary access. The image is awash in movement, creating the impression that we are witnessing an event. The sense of fleeting time produced by the photographers running out in front is reflected in the orientation of the bystanders to one another and to the lens. The second image affirms what remains in the first, only elliptically evident. The people have gathered to celebrate a visit by Léopold Sédar Senghor, the famous poet and philosopher and first president of the Republic of Senegal, as he moves through the streets of Ziguinchor. Neither print is dated, but we know they were taken within seconds of each other on a single occasion in the early 1960s. That these photographs are separated by an infinitesimal span of time becomes apparent when we notice that Senghor, depicted front and center in the second photograph, is also visible in the first, with the same entourage walking in an identical formation in the rear plane. Both photographs depict, in a sense, the end of colonialism and the progress of the newly independent state. In the second image, these events are in tight focus. In the first, however, They are hardly in the frame and have even been eclipsed by the sense of anticipation that the image conveys. To the right, in the latter photograph, the children dressed in white, resembling a school group, quite possibly a group that will perform for the president, catch the eye and hold it longer than expected. For whom or what are they waiting? Young enough to have been born citizens of the newly independent state of Senegal, the children seem to stand in for so many others. Most of them are looking at Senghor, but some are looking at the photographers, amplifying still further the sense of anticipation. In Saint Louis in 2008, Adama Sylla talked to me about the financial and contractual dimensions of political photography as he himself had practiced it in the immediate post-independent years. Our conversations touched on commissioning practices, possibilities for publication, and the logistical aspects of freelance work. His discussions of this work were often exquisitely detailed, so much so that I sometimes grew restless as we circled, it could seem for days, around his memory of a specific event. We discussed the visit of one or another dignitary or head of state, who had photographed it, and which politicians had traveled with their own photographers. Sylla's descriptions of these visits were punctured by asides, during which we turned to look at particular photographs, even if these did not always match exactly the events that he described. Sylla had not been able to locate his own archives of political photography that summer, so we relied heavily on photographs from the collection of Ibrahima Faye, the independence-era governor on whose collections I draw heavily in my book, and these images that you are seeing come from that collection. Sylla took great pride in the commissions that he had done for the local government of La Région du Fleuve. He told me that when the regional governor wanted a photographer to cover one or another visit by a foreign dignitary or head of state, he would pick up the telephone and call Sylla directly. Sylla told me that he depended in doing his freelance work upon the hour-by-hour itineraries of dignitaries' visits, which after independence were made available to the public, and that he followed these itineraries closely alongside other photographers. He explained the importance of these itineraries, which made it possible for photographers to arrive ahead of their subjects by a few minutes, where they then jockeyed for position as they set up their shots. And he described the suspense of standing in a crowd of photographers as they waited outside the door of a particular building for the itineraries to be released. Only later did I come to understand that these itineraries had been quite literally published. As I was killing time one afternoon in the reading room of the CRDS library by flipping through back issues of Dakar Matin, I saw these itineraries printed on the front page, making it possible, at least in theory, for anyone to follow them. When I asked Sylla whether his own photographs had ever been published in the newspapers, he said somewhat stiffly that they had not, adding that these opportunities had been closed to him because they always had, quote, their own photographers. I suspect that by their own, he meant French photographers, although I cannot be sure. Seydou Keita said in his interview with Lydie Diakhaté that with the coming of independence in Bamako, quote, all the European photographers went home. And only then did certain professional opportunities begin to open up. In Senegal, however, the departure of European photographers appears to have been somewhat less abrupt, judging from Sylla's and other photographers' accounts. It is also interesting to consider this comment from the standpoint of the image with which I began, in which a European photographer can be seen running out in front of Senghor alongside his African colleague. Two photographers vying for the same shot, one ostensibly representing the ex-colonial power and political vision, the other ostensibly the post-colonial one. I myself would be asked a version of this question about the publication of African photographers' political work when I presented from this research in its very early stages in academic settings in London. In these settings, I found that the idea that West African photographers had engaged in official and political work in any serious or significant way was met with an almost violent skepticism. More than once, I was asked if they were so engaged in this type of work, why were their images never published? These questions were, I have since come to understand, circumscribed by a fundamentally narrow understanding of photography history in West Africa, by the assumption, for example, that print publications can be a standard for assessing the extent of photographic circulation in the region. They cannot. They were also characterized by a surprising naivete with regard to the monopoly on photojournalism and other documentary work that was held by French photographers in the AOF until a very late date. I was therefore all the more gratified when a few years later, I read an interview with Malick Sidibé by Michelle Lamounière. She asks, were any of your reportage photographs ever published in the newspapers here? He responds, no, not in the papers, no way. The only papers that could have published those kinds of photographs were the state-run papers, and they had their own photographers. An explicit desire to combat this overly narrow understanding of photography's African histories has motivated my methodological decision to privilege the stories that were told to me by photographers over almost every other type of source. The point is not to romanticize photographers' position as eyewitnesses to this period of history, or to attribute undue authority to a single voice, but rather to amplify their insights into photographs that can themselves be very difficult to track down in any systematic way, because these images were rarely integrated into institutional archives and were still more rarely published, or because they have not always endured as physical or material objects. It is also necessary, therefore, to define the materiality of the archive as broadly as possible, to include all of these images that are not where we might expect them to be, or that do not exist anymore. Even in those cases where political photographs taken by African photographers who sought to document the birth of the post-colonial state have entered institutional collections, there are real challenges to their preservation. In addition, my own and others' research suggests that political photographs of the post-colonial state in West Africa may be no more secure once they have entered the archives of that state. The precariousness of this inclusion can be explained, at least in part, by the fact that the National Archive is a remnant of European colonialism in West Africa, a point that both Liam Buckley and Achille Mbembe have made in their trenchant analyses. But many other factors also contribute to this precariousness. Thank you. I'll stop there, stop my share, and pass the mic to Malick.
Hello, everybody. I would like to thank Jennifer for joining me in this conversation about her book, which I have enjoyed reading, and I'm also looking forward to discussing with her and Danielle. Thank you, Danielle, for moderating this panel also. In this book, I met well-known faces and names whose work I respect, and I think that Jennifer has spelled some name, such as my colleague Leslie Rabin, Fatima Fall, and Frank Ogu, as well as all the photographers who have greatly contributed to make their knowledge and heritage available. Since this is a conversation, I decided to start by sharing my global impression of the book with you. Following Jennifer herself, let me set the historical context of the research. Jennifer was moved in 1999 when she showed a photograph of Seydou Keita in a Parisian gallery. Since then, she has had this project to research photography, focusing on the development of photography in Senegal and Benin, within the overall framework of the evolution of the practice worldwide. This magnificent book is articulated around two main parts, divided into 3 chapters each, followed by a list of notes, a bibliography, as well as an index that helps with research. This book is well documented with series of interviews with famous photographers. We have witness history, a series of archives, institutional archives, most of them political one, of family and archive from family also, we have possession of them. And she visits institutions such as the Centre de Recherche et de Documentation du Sénégal in Saint-Louis, where Adama Silla, one of the photographers interviewed, worked. So the book has drawn on a variety of studies to complete the knowledge of photography in Africa. It is a dialogue with several researchers and several artists and photographers. Thus, it offers us a historical overview mixed with a social history of photography that also fits with the history of mobility on the continent. For example, it is not surprising that the first photographic practice, including the famous studios, were developed in the coastal area before penetrating inland. Going back to a rich critique of photography, quoting, for example, the work of Erika Nimis, it showed the correlation between the migration of many Black, often freed from a slave or for descendant of them like Augustin Washington, and the dispersion of photographic practice in Africa. Following the rich history of photography, you show that this medium is intimately linked to Africa with its very early introduction in this continent, in Egypt by Horace Vernet and his nephew Frédéric Goupil-Fresquet during their trip to the Orient. So the book is a fresco that shows how photography has accompanied the history of political, social, and intellectual changes, but especially the history of mentality by evoking the transformation of the colonial fact and its strategy for circumventing power, as well as exclusion from political life. The fixed image accompany the evolution of our idea and the socio-political mutation. We can ask ourselves, for example, to what extent the image has given a new destiny to the country of the continent. The report on photography in the political sphere, for example, is a testament to the autonomy of newly independent states and the representation they make of their newly acquired power. All the other factors like film, pose of other photography that has traveled, poster or magazine pages that have had an influence on the studio photograph show a circulation of the imaginary that photography allows to facilitate. Given that the photographers themselves, like Keita, Silla, Lee, were themselves often itinerant in their respective country. Finally, photography was a medium of sociability that kept people at a distance and create a virtual community that converse through images. The circulation of photo of Senegalese soldier, for example, in other African countries, the photo published in Bingo magazine, and the network created by the invitation to send photo to the magazine, bear witness to this. All this create, a very global community that the link is photography, images. So the book shows that the practice of photography in Africa disrupt and deconstruct the idea of this medium in the social order. The book always borders on the other history that does not embrace completely. It is the history of photography in contemporary art today, which also bend the history of a deconstruction and reconstruction of the archives, as we can see it with Samuel Fosso or Omar Victor Diop, for example. preoccupied with showing the colonial period, Jennifer's book does not focus on how this photographic practice gradually fell into the category of contemporary art, but she navigates with several references that show us the mechanics by which photographers would later be caught in the trap of the art market and their work considered as such. For example, the relationship between photography and industry, I mean the book of in filigree, a little history of technology also. So this relationship between photography and industry is premonitory of such a fact, as well as the local market for social use that is provoked, associated with the need for aesthetization that is solicited from photographer and the public. We can discover that many of the premonitory elements of the contemporary art public's infatuation with these photographs are already in place during the colonial period. Because through the book, I can read that the development of photographic practice is correlate with the social organization of the market economy and the emergence of individual consumption, appreciation, and reception of images. So what about decoloniality now in this book? The fact of showing the appropriation of photography in Africa counterbalance the widely shared understanding that photography was always an instrument of violence and coercion imposed by the Western gaze. Thus, the decolonial perspective is not longer carried toward a decolonization conceived as a posture with regard to what this practice was during the colonial period and what the camera played in the hand of the colonizer. It is a more maybe liberating decoloniality of imaginary, co-construct with the camera of another universe that escape Western epistemic and analytical category in the practice of photography as much as in its relationship to social practice. So the book attempt to break out of the global power relationship in which a certain critic want to place every image taken by the colonized subject. In doing so, the argument of Jennifer is that the critics downplays the aesthetic approach at works in many images. Instead of seeing violence in colonial photography everywhere and deducing a spontaneous response from African photographer, it exploits through authors like Mamadou Diouf, for example, the possibility of an influence of Western cinema on the poses. So this opens up a very broad perspective that focuses us to look at the way iconography has developed in both the photography and the glass painting, with which the photograph shares some similarity. And maybe here it is also another jump in art history, how photography is connected with the medium of art history in the continent. But about this decoloniality and this contradiction, maybe here we can also conceive another model of decoloniality, because decolonizing images or decolonizing representation is not consumed every time in the perspective of colonial subject. That's why maybe we should also open the possibility that is a direct link between violence, decoloniality, and aesthetic. Because how to conceive the aesthetic of decolonization is, for me, underline all Jennifer research, even if the link is not already done. In my opinion, That is what the concept of maybe vernacular cosmopolitanisms underline also, because the description of the history of Saint Louis, in which the history of photography is closely intertwined, show a cosmopolitanism that Mamadou Diouf described as vernacular, and in which it is expressed in the city, particularly, I quote, to elucidate aspect of colonial modernity and associated cultural, social, and political phenomena that cannot be simply attributed to European influence or traced along a center-periphery axis. This is why the notion of heterotopia applicable in Sierra Leone, for example, was replaced by Jennifer with the Mamadou Diouf notion of vernacular cosmopolitanisms. From a theoretical point of view, this study has the merit of adapting also several notions that it brings back to the practice of photography. Perhaps contrary to vernacular cosmopolitanisms that replace heterotopia, the use of intermediality or interferentiality, there is even much that risk at the moment to bring back the study to a conceptual history that seems for me to dissolve more the decolonial perspective in a history of concepts that are blurred because widely used and fashionable in several academic spheres. But finally, I was also touched by the writing style. The narrative cachet of the discourse make it a story that, while following the trail of photography, traces a social history of field research and show how the researcher established political relationship with family, informal on the ground, like our this artist Bunamedun say, or even with his guide, the driver. But as we follow the story, we read in filigree the enormous looting that this medium did in the 90s when several European curator and collector approached family and photographer motivated by money. There is a second issue that is concomitant to the first one, and that brings us back to question of methodology in the face of the uncertainty and unpredictability inherent in any research work. What is important in Jennifer's work is the unexpected discovery that pose problem of methodology. As for example, Mrs. Job's wife who tells that she had reproduced several photos of her husband who had to get up early to go to his job as an accountant. There is also the context of the research, as well as the material condition in which the investigation takes place, as well as the unexpected circumstances of not filming or recording important conversation, for example. We have many things to say about this book and how this book permits us to discover another part of the history of photography, which was not shown, this political history of photography. It is an important contribution to the field of photography research by showing very new archive from some family and by connecting the study with the old literature and photography. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this book, and thank you for sharing this during this panel.
Thank you, Dr. Malick.
Thank you, Dr.
This was very fascinating. You've brought up a very rich panel of fascinating thoughts. And before Jennifer has a chance to maybe pick up on some of the questions and thoughts you raised, let me just share that for me, particularly as a painter, was also fascinating that you repeatedly referred to painting. Not you even called the book a fresco, which I found particularly interesting because a fresco is kind of the technique of painting on a wet ground, working pigments into a plaster, so the pigments become actually part of the wall of the plaster. So it's not working on let's say on a dead surface, but it goes. It's in kind of an immersion that is very interesting to kind of work with this picture. Maybe we can have a conversation about that at some point as well. So Jennifer, I hope this couple of sentences gave you a little bit of time to come up with a comment or a response. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Malick, I'm looking at my notes and I've written like 2 pages of notes on what you've shared and I'm still processing, but thank you. I'm also still thinking about what it means to think of the book as a fresco, since I am not a painter, Daniel. A couple things, and this may be that I need clarification, Malick, but a couple things that really stand out to me that I'm really thrilled that you've centered here in your response. The first is really about contemporary art and the place of photography in contemporary art on the continent, right? That you've referenced, right? That I don't actually follow that, you know, although I acknowledge that in fact, this is a very significant sort of horizon of my research. And I think of so many contemporary artists as fellow knowledge producers or kindred knowledge producers. They are engaging with the archive and thinking through and theorizing these images and these practices and their residues. I don't come up to the present day and I don't sort of make the theoretical or historical articulation with contemporary art practice. And I'm really grateful to you for underscoring that and how important it is to, in fact, I think, finish the story, right? And I think that the rest of the story is incredibly interesting, right? And my research did not follow, in fact, the story through to the present day and to contemporary practice. And, you know, I think there are reasons for that are, you know, quite mundane and not very interesting often. But one of the interesting reasons is I think that the photographers I worked with themselves of the independence generation did not see that connection, or were not always able to see that connection, right? They're not in that conversation with a younger generation of artists, or rarely are they in that conversation, or rarely can that conversation be grasped, you know, from one site, from one city, right, on the ground. The networks that they had when they were practicing, right, they don't have anymore in the same way, right? So I think that's actually interesting, and I'd be really interested to hear from you. It feels like a gap and a loss, right? That the photographers often have not been invited into that conversation or don't see themselves as part of that conversation. And I'd be really interested to hear from you as an active curator in Dakar, and moving around the continent and the world. You know, I'd be very interested to hear from you what you think the possibilities are for, you know, staging that conversation. Is it too late, right, with the older generation? But they weren't invited in, and they didn't often know of that conversation. So I guess it's a different kind of methodological labor that I would have had to have done, right? That said, I think related to this point, a really significant phenomenon that facilitated my research and made it possible for me to access the photographers' collections that I did has been commented on by figures like B.C. Silva, for example, before she passed, and also commented on in the context of the 3PA workshop in Benin in 2014. And that is that many photographers of the independence generation all over the continent did bequeath their archives to younger photographers, right? So there was some intergenerational transfer and conversation and connection, but it didn't always make it quite into the contemporary art space or to the kind of international contemporary art discourse. So it's not that some transfer and some translation didn't take place. We know it did, right? And there are younger photographers and artists who can bring those conversations forward, but I was not able to really tap into that space in my research. I just also wanted to say that so I'd be eager to hear from you, Malick, on that. And the question of decoloniality, I think I will refrain from saying anything that might sound empty or semantic, but what I was really interested in when I chose that frame, in the moment that I chose it, was this overwhelming articulation of photography with modernity as a kind of dual construct, right? And this idea that there will never be a photography that's not already bound up in some way with colonial modernity. And I really wanted to challenge the capacity of the photographers, of particular images, of the practices, of the social forms that you so brilliantly cataloged. I wanted to look at those practices as potentially challenging that, you know, that fusion of photography with colonial modernity, to begin to look at what comes after, right? To begin to look at the alternative forms or the formations or the more complex tangled formations that challenge that paradigm. And I already think the moment is very different in regard to the dominant discourse from when I wrote the book. So, you know, there may be ample questions, there may be opportunities to discuss that, but I already think we can grasp much more readily concepts of photography that are not so bound up with 19th and 20th century formations. I think even, you know, in the last 10 years, I think some of that work has been done. So I don't want to talk more until I'd love to hear from you, Malick, about anything that I've already responded, but I'd love to hear about the contemporary art conversation from you, because you're in such a privileged position in that regard.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, no, I think that about contemporary art, photography linked, relating to contemporary art, it is, I suppose it is not the question here, because it should be a second book, you know, it should be the the book that conclude the long history, because the category of photography has contemporary art, and all the speculation around this photographer will come later. So I understand so much the reason why we can mix these two history, because the universe and the representation, the organization of the market, and the circulation of the photography, all these things are not, you know, connected with what will rise during the 80s or 90s about, you know, this contemporary art market around this photography. So maybe I think that it will be important, in order to complete this long, very rich history, to focus on it in the future, because when we talk about photography today, even if we talk about contemporary art, photography in contemporary art, we every time return to the history and try to make the link with how the first photographer emerged. And in order to know this context, we should also, to know this historical context, we should also understand, because it's a reverse, we should understand what photography will be in our contemporary, later in our contemporary epoch. About the decoloniality, I think that, you know, I will understand how you use this concept and how you play with it. And I think that sure, decoloniality is related to this how photographer make free imagination, make free the representation. But what I would like to focus on is that many scholars talk about decoloniality as like a very conscious project, a very conscious, organization. And I would like to serve in this, in the other sense of decoloniality, where the machine, like photography, in the hand of lambda people, the people of everywhere, can have his own rationality in a global context where it used to play another role. Even if we can, I agree with you, every time interpret every single image has a very colonial or violence of the representation of, colonizer, the gaze of this representation of colonizer. I would like to focus on the fact that we can make maybe a narration of this own rationality that will not focus directly on how the colonized subject has a free project and a very conscious project to say, okay, I will go to decolonize images. So we should have this very global sociology of how this machine was used during this period. It will be very rich to make this theoretical point of view as we conceive this photograph like a machine that has its own rationality in this global context.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful and really beautiful and gives us a lot of food for thought. Daniel, do you want to open it up, or do you have questions, or I'm not looking.
I would like to, yeah. So yeah, I'm looking. I'm monitoring time. So if we begin to switch to open to the audience for open it up for questions of the audience, then we can do that. I mean, looking at the Q&A box here, there are no questions at this point. So people seem to be a little bit shy. So I was, can I come up with a very a very broad question for you, Jennifer? I was thinking about the title, listening to you earlier, Unfixed, which suggests, of course, a state of fluency, variability, and we just heard Malick bring up the exciting question of the apparatus in this whole context, also, which is a kind of a very kind of an opposite concept, if you like, to the translucency and the fluidity of a concept like the unfixed. So I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about the connection to the how you connect the title, or how you came to the title of the book? Is there something to share on that level?
Well, there's lots to share. There's lots to share. I mean, I will say that, it's not a wholly original title, but I was hoping that it would function on multiple registers, and it seems that it hasn't always been taken up in that way. So I was really interested in notions of photographic temporality and time that we don't tend to associate with the fixed image, right? The photograph understood as the fixed image. So although in the introduction to the book, which many people, it seems, have, or that's the part that people have taken up and have been teaching or discussing kind of in photo history and theory circles, you know, this notion that there are significant traditions of photography, specifically portraiture, across West Africa that are not particularly invested in the notion of an image as a fixed thing, right? But that there is more fluidity, more what we would consider to be manipulation, post-production manipulation, and so on, of the image. And so that's only one part of what I had hoped the title would do. And what I had really hoped the title would do, and I hope it will still, is really think about these longer timescales of what happens when we return to these photographs from this period of history now, and the kinds of conversations, the kinds of interpretations, the kinds of meanings that they produce in hindsight, retrospectively, often with complications of nostalgia or revision, right, with regard to this very sort of punctual moment, right, in history. And so I would like to think of the archives as not fixed, right, and the meanings of the images as not fixed, maybe even as Malick has given us this beautiful phrase, you know, the rationality of the machine or the apparatus continues to unfold, right? And so that's something that it felt extremely important for me to mark in relation to this material, right? That there's not a fixed set of meanings or even an end to the rationality that produces the images. I don't know if that's helpful, Daniel, or kind of in line with
very helpful. That's very helpful. Thank you for that. And I would like to actually have a question that relates in a beautiful way from Ajay Sina, who you know, also who asked also, and it goes back to the role of contemporary art in this context. And the question is, if not contemporary art, are there other lineages of that moment of independence in more contemporary practices, photojournalism, for instance?
Other lineages of that moment of independence in more contemporary practices. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there other lineages of the moment of independence in more contemporary practices, like photojournalism, for instance?
Yeah. If I understand the question, and I'm still trying to, but thank you, Ajay. This is a beautiful question. What I see as another lineage, or a lineage with which we have very intimate experience now, is the kinds of images that we saw emerge in the summer of 2020, where people were trying to decide if it was a revolution taking place in the streets around the global movement for Black lives, around large protests and gatherings in the streets, taking place around the felling of the monuments, right? And the various kinds of moments of intensification around the Colston Monument, you know, even in Rhodes Must Fall, right? There were these earlier precursors and so on of these moments where there was an incredible futility and an incredible excitement and sense of anticipation that was being read off the same images, right? So these were not photojournalistic images in the sense that some of the photographers I was working with would have understood them, those working in the 50s and 60s, but these kind of images in public space, moving into public space, but also images of public space that were very contested around their kind of affective meaning or origin. There's something there that for me felt very familiar as an alternative lineage. So is an image incredibly hopeful, and is it an image of an impending revolution or a sense of anticipation, or is it incredibly demoralizing? There's something about that affective dimension of these public images that we've seen quite recently that is familiar. So I don't know if, Ajay, that is even remotely in the space of what you were asking, but that's what I can make of the question. I don't know if Malick, you have a thought.
I don't understand the question, but I think about what you are saying, Jennifer, that during 2020, you know, all these images that we used to see around the world from all these activisms, some of them was included in contemporary practice and contemporary practice of photography also. But what is interesting here is the difference and the similarity between the images and his discourse in activisms, maybe in the public space, and the other discourse that we raised in contemporary art when we are creating or we are constructing new archives. And it seemed to me that contemporary art is very interesting here because he make very deep our comprehension of what archive should be now in our contemporary view, contemporary context, because in this public images, we have many things to see, but contemporary art transform those things into knowledge. I don't know if you feel what I would like to say. We have, for example, photojournalism in the public sphere that coach everything, but that only show them. But contemporary artists, many of them make possible another, view of these images that was coached from Black Lives Matter, from George Floyd, and from all this public manifestation against public heritage of some colonial figures in Bristol, in Paris, everywhere. And I love this kind of contemporary art, creating new archive and new knowledge from these photojournalistic images.
Yeah, thank you, Malick. It's also maybe something to think about. Is it possible to juxtapose contemporary and photojournalism so clearly? And I'm thinking of Kiluanji Inda's approach of like the monument, the counter monument. And so we have another question. We have actually quite some questions. I would like to pick up something that an anonymous attendee shared here. Appreciations to Jennifer and Malick. But then following the first question, I was wondering if you discussed the question of artification of these images, mostly studio pictures, with the photographers you interviewed. What was their viewpoint about the inclusion of some of them, mostly the very known Malian photographers, into the art market and institutions worldwide, but obviously mostly in Europe and America? So we are going to the archives.
So thank you for that question. I mean, yes, of course, I discussed the artification of portraiture with photographers frequently. And it's a phenomenon to which they had a very ambivalent relation, and often even a very, I would say, partial appreciation of the extent to which it's actually taken place. So a very frequent, a very kind of frequent, common conversation that would take place when I would arrive as a researcher on the ground in a place like Dakar or Cotonou is I would be introduced to a photographer, and younger members of that family might ask if I could make, their father famous, right? Like if I could do an exhibition and make them famous, and could I do for their father what others had done. And it was often not Seydou Keita who was a reference. Most people in Senegal had other Senegalese photographers, right? That Revue Noire had come through in the 90s and done, a significant number of publications, as well as a significant number of exhibitions in France. So I was often explicitly asked if I could bring that artification to the spaces in which I was working. So that's a factual, empirical answer. And, my position as a researcher was essentially one explicitly of refusal that was not my project, which doesn't mean those desires went away in the conversations. Those desires remain very active and very live in those conversations. And there would be much more to say about them. I think that, I will say, in case it isn't totally clear, and I think Malick understands this, that one of the reasons it was so important to me not to write a book only about portraiture was in part to decenter that kind of process that has been, the focus, right, of the research has been to bring portraits out for exhibitions, in high profile art world exhibitions that might potentially be lucrative, at least for a fleeting period of time for a family. So I really wanted to resist that force, but people had hoped that I would be part of that often in my research.
Yeah, thank you. I remember seeing a show in the late 90s was called Snap Me One in Germany. That was a show it traveled by Roy to other places in Germany, and I think even made it to the Smithsonian. So the question of, so this was kind of creating or pushing the value of things up, of these objects up by kind of communicating them in, and then it's interesting also to keep track of where did things actually end up, and how kind of what is the current situation then on this level in terms of preserving the archive. What are the various interests that kind of play a role in there, and and how and why is that, can it be preserved? So your 3PA project is maybe also related to that, right?
Absolutely, and I try to give that project, which was a massive collaboration, which we hope will have a future, quite a lot of space in the concluding chapter of the book. And I think that, that was my very idealistic gesture, that we might continue to be able to bring collection keepers, both in institutional contexts and in community-based collections, together to continue to share resources and actually have, sort of more options in terms of how they might present their collections to international or non-African publics, right? While retaining some kind of control, some kind of agency, some kind of decision-making power over the fate of those archives. So I think that it is a fact, I'll just say this briefly, that right now, often allowing an archive to be sold to a European collector or a North American collector often can still seem like the best chance at preservation of that archive. And that's the issue, right, that we were trying to address in the preservation workshop, was to start to to invest in spaces that would allow collections and archives to stay on the continent and continue to be exploited, commercially, artistically, aesthetically, by African collection keepers, right? So.
Thank you. Malik, would you like to address or make a comment to the archive as well? Before I address another question that also relates to the kind of the future, before we go there.
Maybe a short thing. When I heard Jennifer saying that she was approached by family in order to make their parents famous, it's a very sad situation, because it explains why this very large cultural heritage disappeared, because and somehow this book go, because it not focused on portraiture, on this history well known and supported by our market. This book is maybe go against our market and permits those archives to have a new dimension, to have a new vision, to permit us also to see this cultural archive, and even with the family, because the book is another way to make those fathers, those mothers, those parents famous. But here we generally the people see money behind this kind of famous, and that's why we lost so many archives. And we should now try to study new way of documenting, of creating instrument and institution that are capable to preserve and conserve this cultural heritage. Fortunately, we have new museum. Maybe those museums have this capacity, money to fund, to push us some photography from this family. But this book allowed us to know many of them. For example, me, I know so much Gibril Andre Diop, one of the son of this big photographer, Doudou Diop. He's an artist. I used to work to deal with Gibril Andre Diop, but I never know his history of relating to to photography. I never make the connection with Doudou Diop and Gibril. So this book helped us discovering new history, and maybe in the future, when an institution would like to approach some family in order to conserve, to safeguard this archive, it will be this book will be a guide, of this, and that's why I say that it go against our market and try to contribute to the conservation of cultural heritage in Africa, in Senegal particularly.
Well, this would be a wonderful end for the panel, actually, this comment that you just made, Malik. But we have 3 minutes left, and maybe I would like, I don't know how you feel about this. I would like to bring up this last question, one more question, which is, maybe you can only briefly respond to that. It's a question from Margit Hardy, and the question is, how is the, quote, embodied nature of image perception related to photographers' ability to imagine, enunciate political community that may not yet be realized? Would you like to respond to that or
I feel as if the question almost answers itself.
Mm-hmm. Or add to it.
I have very little to add. I have very little to add. I think that it's so beautifully formed as a question. I think the only thing that I would say is this is another argument against artification, or to go against the grain of the art market, right? In the sense that, in all the ways we've discussed, in the sense that political community is formed around these images and engagements with these images as physical objects, as photographs. And so often in my research, I found, those who've read the book will know, but so often in my research, I found that even when the photograph wasn't there, there was a capacity for a memory of a photograph to elicit certain forms of community and exchange. And so that, to me, should be included in the embodied nature of image perception, is the residue that an image that is maybe missing or disappearing or not quite where it should be, that capacity also allows forms of political community to form. And so that temporality, I think, is something very important to me in relation to this question, right? I would ask these things to be thought under the heading of the embodied nature of image perception.
Yeah, thank you. You beautifully also looped it back to Malick's earlier comment of that this book is against the grain of the art market. And so I would like, it's also a great thing if we can conclude this panel in time. And but I would like to really briefly thank Omar Dahi very explicitly for kind of hosting this and being so active behind the scenes here, and as the key figure for this making this panel happen, and security and context in this relation, of course, as well. So Malick, would you like to share a final thought?
I have not special, discourse to for this magnifique and wonderful work of Jennifer, because I will have many things to say. But I would like to share my gratitude with Jennifer and inviting me to discuss. And I would like also to encourage, Jennifer to continue to, because it will be very easy to make this connection and to continue this, history. Because I think that this book is part 1, so you should have a part 2. And I was very happy to share my thinking, my reflection on this book, which is very deeply researched, particularly in Senegal, that I know so much institution and many people that are in the book. I discovered them under a new angle. So, and I discovered also this very rich and cultural, we should definitely work on on a program of preservation of this very fragile cultural patrimony. Senegal is country of painting. We focus on visual art, and in the history of this art history, we have so much artists that are in, painting, sculpture, and others. But we have also very nice photographer. Some of them, Mama Kase, and the others are well known. We should now try to preserve this heritage in order to link it with the very dynamic contemporary history of photography now. So for all this, Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Omar. And thank you, all of you who are watching this conversation.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Malick Ndiaye. Thank you, Professor Jennifer Bajorek. And let's conclude this wonderful panel. I'm very grateful that you invited me to play a little role in this beautiful conversation. Thanks to the audience as well for participating. I hope you will have a great weekend. Bye-bye.